Blessings, everyone. I'm Ras.
And I'm Kathy.
We're Team UltraPedestrian, and this is Hominid UP. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on the very first episode of Hominid UP. I'm sure right off the bat you're wondering what in the heck we mean by Hominid UP. We're essentially referring to phrases people use like man up, time to woman up, time to cowboy up, cowgirl up. That idea of bringing your best game, bringing your top-notch game, or fully realizing what you're capable of in whatever it is that you're approaching. So we're bringing that approach to all forms of bipedalism. That's what we enjoy. We're thru-hikers, trail runners, ultra-runners, mountaineers, cross-country skiers. You know, we love going out and moving through beautiful and challenging places under human power. So when we refer to hominids, we're referring to not so much specifically or literally an ancient class of bipeds that predated and or included human beings, although that is the literal meaning of it. But we're referring to a more ancient and a more essential aspect of our humanity from which modern day first world humans to a great degree are alienated. So when we say Hominid UP, we're talking about digging deep, reconnecting with and channeling your inner hominid and reconnecting with the most ancient aspects of being human in order to be a fully realized human and to bring our best game to this game that is life. So that's what we mean when we say Hominid UP, and that's what we're talking about. You'll hear us referencing hominids all the time because it's what fascinates us about bipedalism and about all of these things that we enjoy so much. So this isn't specifically for runners. This isn't specifically for hikers. This is specifically for human beings. That's our audience. That is our focus, human-powered adventure. And essentially, I mean, there's two basic things that evolutionary biologists and psychologists consider to define human beings and separate them from other animals. And those two things are bipedal locomotion, moving upright on two legs over extended distances, and what they refer to as gossip, but they don't mean talking crap about somebody behind their back. They're talking about relating and transmitting third-person information. So being able to transmit information from one person to another and convey abstract ideas to people who haven't seen or experienced it firsthand. So those two things are essentially what this podcast is about, and essentially what this podcast is an expression of. So you could, in those terms, say that a podcast about hiking and running is one of the most essentially human things that you could even produce. And that's our goal, not only to produce that, but along the way to share our story of how we have discovered these things and the techniques that we've developed to be able to Hominid UP, to be able to access those ancient human abilities and apply them in the modern world. We've discovered over the years through our own personal experience, as well as through lots of reading and other forms of research, that ordinary people are capable of amazing and extraordinary things. And that's going to be one of our main focuses, not only promoting that idea and documenting the places where we see that idea being put forth and lived, but in also giving tips on how you can do that yourself, on how you as an ordinary human being can achieve amazing and extraordinary things. So those are the goals of our podcast, and we're going to be sharing our firsthand experiences and information and tips and tricks as to how to do all that. So right off the bat, UltraPedestrian, the name we use to refer to ourselves, and it's also the name of our website. So you can Google UltraPedestrian, you can find our Instagram, find us on Facebook, all those things, of course. So, but what do we mean by that? We came up with the term UltraPedestrian a bunch of years ago. It was really when I had got into ultra running and decided to take on the inaugural Pigtails Challenge 200 around Lake Young's, a 200-mile race, first one in Washington State being offered. And in preparing for that, I decided I was going to document what I was doing and my experience at the race, and was trying to come up with a name for a blog. And over the couple of years at that point that I'd been participating in ultra marathons, I always found it funny that it's called ultra running, and yet a lot of the time you'll be hiking as much as you are running. And certain races, like when I ran the Tahoe 200 in its first year, I conservatively estimate that I hiked 75% of that race, and at most ran 25%. So ultra running just always seemed like a really inaccurate term, and a very limiting term, because we come from a backpacking background. We're really backpackers that became back of the packers. Neither of us has a background in running. Neither of us ran in high school or college or anything like that, like a lot of runners did. So that term just seemed eminently inaccurate and limiting to me. And I came up with the idea of ultrapedestrian to simply refer to using all forms of bipedal locomotion in order to achieve ultra distance or long distances. So technically ultra in the ultra running context means greater than a marathon distance, so greater than 26.2 miles or 42 kilometers, but we're not going to strictly stick to that. We're just going to use it to refer to covering long distances on foot. But part of what we love about the term ultrapedestrian is that not only does it mean covering extreme distances on foot, but if you parse the terms, pedestrian can mean lowbrow. So ultrapedestrian can also mean exceedingly commonplace. And we love that secondary meaning of it and feel that that really makes the term whole, that it's really a dialectic where it has those two seemingly opposite definitions, which together form a more accurate meaning than either of them does on their own. So that's the meaning of ultrapedestrian, and that's our whole philosophy and approach that we've developed over the years, and that's where we're going to be coming from in this podcast and with the information that we share with you. So we have big plans for this podcast. We're pretty excited about getting going on this because we just have so much information to share and ideas that we want to put out there, because we want people to be able to use these hacks that we've developed and these things that we've learned about being human over the years, and see people be able to apply those to their lives and do more amazing things and have more amazing experiences. So we've got a lot of stuff in store. We're going to be starting this off just as a monthly podcast, and we're going to be releasing the full complete episode to our Patreon patrons. So anybody who wants to get involved with that can go to patreon.com/ultrapedestrian. And for $1.25 a month, if you just want to be a listener, you just want to get the full podcast and the other exclusive content that we have on there, including our old UltraPedestrian podcast. All 4 of those episodes are on there for our Patreons that we put out years ago. I know those are hard to find. I don't think they're on the web anywhere anymore nowadays, but we did collect them up and get them in there, and other exclusive content. But for $1.25 a month, you can get the complete podcast for essentially the price of an old school magazine subscription. And we have a special going right now where anybody that joins at the supporter level, so that's $7 a month or more, gets a free signed copy of our book, 98 Days of Wind, The Greatest Fail of Our Life. So that tells the story of our attempt to yo-yo the Grand Enchantment Trail a couple of years ago and everything that happened to us along the way, which we had some crazy adventures, camping in culverts and doing some crazy road walks and long stretches without water, all those great adventures that are part of a desert thru-hike like that. So anybody joining during this limited time offer at the $7 a month level as a supporter gets a free signed copy of our book. We'll be mailing those out in the middle of May when we get back from our upcoming speaking tour about the Up North Loop. So if you want to help support Team UltraPedestrian and help make our adventures happen, help keep us out on the trail, delving into these mysteries of the amazing things of which ordinary people are capable and sharing that information, if you want to help make that happen, or if you just want to get some of the exclusive content that we're offering, please head on over to patreon.com/ultrapedestrian and sign up at the level of your choice. Again, people signing up at the $7 level get a signed copy of our book, 98 Days of Wind, for a limited time only. And if you're like, hey, cut the sales pitch, I'm just here for the free stuff, we got you covered. We're going to be putting out podcasts each month with selected segments from the complete podcast, and we'll be serializing those so that you can still get a lot of these great tips and tricks and hacks on how to channel your inner hominid. So don't worry, we're not going to be keeping information from anybody. We're going to get it out there. But if you want some of the extra inside info and you want to have that behind the scenes look and learn more about exactly who we are and how we've lived our lives to get where we are and how we do what we do, then head on over to our Patreon and check that out. Our real focus that we've developed over the years after all of our different hiking and running experiences really is on those ancient and fundamentally human aspects of life. So much in our modern everyday lives seems to alienate us from that. And Kathy and I just feel it's so important to remind people to not let that slip through your fingers and not get so caught up in the modern world that you lose those ancient aspects of your humanity that make you truly alive and that are the things that truly lead to happiness. If you're in touch with those ancient human aspects, then you can fully enjoy and appreciate the modern world. But if you're out of touch with that part of yourself, you'll just never be complete and never be fully alive. And that's a tragedy. That's what we're hoping to help people avoid. Because we firmly not only believe, but think and seem to have found it documented in scientific studies and related in other people's experience that moving around outside affects human brain chemistry. Now, brain chemistry, that has to do with our personalities, with who we are, with our moods, with our experience of life. Like all of those things are influenced by our brain chemistry. So by just going outside and moving through the natural world and having that experience, feeling your blood start pumping and taking deep breaths as you exert yourself a little bit and smelling all the smells and receiving the other sensory input that we might not even be aware of, as well as the sights and hearing the wind in your ears and feeling it on your skin and sensing the difference in temperatures between the inside and the outside and between the direct sun and the shade and all of those things. That's all information that our bodies used to take in constantly. And in a modern world where you live in a climate-controlled box and then you drive a climate-controlled box to where you work in another climate-controlled box, you don't get to have those basic sensory experiences that are part of the feedback that your body needs for you to adapt to and thrive in your environment on every level, not only physically, but mentally and emotionally. So we firmly believe that going outside and moving around is beneficial for human brain chemistry, and anything that we can do to encourage and educate and inspire more people to go outside and move around will just make more happy, healthy people on the planet. So that's our long-term goal with this whole experiment we've been conducting on ourselves for years now, to try to increase the collective psychological health and happiness of human beings as a species. It's a big goal. It might be beyond the scope of a simple podcast, but our specialty is kind of taking on seemingly impossible things and having surprisingly good results. So we're going to do that with the podcast as well. So in a nutshell, that is what we are going for with this podcast that we call Hominid Up. And while we will be focusing on physical aspects of this, such as techniques, running, and efficient motion techniques for hiking as well, talking about things like gear, not only brands of specific gear, but gear you can do without, gear you can improvise, gear that you can get along the way on big trips, and all those aspects, cross-training, fueling. We'll be talking a lot about the physical aspects of endurance adventuring, but even more than that, we're going to be talking about the psychological aspects, the mental aspects, the things going on in your head to help get you going in the first place, to get you off the couch and out the door to get that first mile ever, if that's the place where you're at, or the one to keep you moving past that bench on the course and get you out of the aid station and get you peeling off the last 5 miles of that first 100-miler, if that's what you're after, or the last 5 miles of that 2,600-mile thru-hike, if that's where you're going. So the mental game is going to be a big focus of what we're doing here. A lot of that is going to come from what really isn't that new or controversial an idea at this point, but which still isn't very widespread and hasn't been endorsed by the outdoor industry as much, which is called the psychobiological model of endurance. The one aspect of that some people are familiar with is the concept of the central governor, as put forward by Dr. Tim Noakes out of South Africa. And the very specific example that more and more people are familiar with is the pickle juice experiment. I've recently even seen packages of pickle juice or jars of pickle juice available, put out at races at aid stations. And people loving it, and people slugging down pickle juice and saying that it was really beneficial and effective for them. To me, that's really interesting because that's a very tangential takeaway from the pickle juice experiment. So the pickle juice experiment, for those of you who don't know, is very Googleable. You can look it up and get all the specifics if you want to have every aspect of the facts correct. I'm going to assume that for precisely accurate facts, you're not tuning into this podcast in particular. You can use Google for that. But you can look up the pickle juice experiment, but essentially athletes were given pickle juice and they measured the amount of time it took for it to have a beneficial effect on cramping. And what came out of this experiment was that the cramping was alleviated in most instances in a matter of just a few minutes. And the simple fact is that for pickle juice to get down to your stomach and to be metabolized and then be sent to your muscles, that all of that is impossible in just a few minutes' time. That would take, I think they said 20 to 30 minutes for that to actually happen. So people were drinking pickle juice and they were having a beneficial response in their muscles far faster than was possible for the pickle juice to actually be metabolized in their stomachs and whatever nutrient was being used then sent to your muscles. So what Tim Noakes and his team concluded from this was that it wasn't a strictly biological response, but that it was a neuromuscular response. That when your tongue tasted pickle juice, it caused your brain to send a message to your muscles, which alleviated the cramping. But it did it in a way where it couldn't have been the direct effect of the pickle juice. In fact, you could argue, at least theoretically, that one wouldn't even need to swallow the pickle juice, that if all you have to do is taste it to cause this neuromuscular response, you could simply swish your mouth with it and spit it out. I don't know if follow-up experiments have been done to verify that aspect, but that would be fascinating to me. So the psychobiological model of endurance is going to be one of the kind of mainstays of where we're coming from, even if we don't speak about it in those terms. But at this point, if we've piqued your interest, you might be wondering, okay, so who exactly are you and why would I be interested in your opinion on these matters? So how about if we give you a fairly in-depth background on each of ourselves as individuals and as a couple, and we can start with Kathy.
Okay. I grew up in a place called Mossy Rock, which is just a small town nestled in the foothills of Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, and Mount Adams. And I went to school there from the time I was in first grade until I graduated from high school. I graduated in a very small class with about 27, I think, other students. And it was just a really mellow country way of growing up. My mom was a nurse, and she worked as a school nurse and a visiting nurse. And then my dad worked for the Department of Natural Resources. He was a career guy with the DNR. I'm a middle child. I have an older sister. She's a year and a half older than I am, and a brother that's about 2 years younger than I am. I really was a pretty quiet, shy child. I was a good student and was just very devoted to getting good grades in school and studying really hard and being ready to go off to college when it was time. That was really what I felt like was my only option, is that when I graduated from this small high school, I would go on to college. But I really wasn't athletic. I did participate in basketball when I was in junior high school, and I think my freshman and sophomore year in high school. And I also ran track, the kind of like the middle distances, when I was in junior high and high school, but I didn't excel at all. I just enjoyed it very much, just being outside and enjoying the spring weather during track season. I really was quite shy and awkward and clumsy growing up and was not athletic. I was definitely that student that was chosen last to be on any kind of dodgeball or other PE team whenever game teams were being chosen. So that's really my background, not being athletic at all, kind of growing up with allergies and asthma in the spring season and wheezing while I was running my track practices, and not an athletic student by any means. Growing up, my best friends were animals. I had tons of cats. They were all outdoor cats, and I would just spend a lot of time outside with them, maybe try to sneak them in occasionally behind my mom and dad's back. I helped my cats when they were having their kittens. My mom jokes around that they would come find me so that I could kind of be their midwife and help them give birth, which is just silly. So I definitely know how kittens are born. And my sister had horses. I loved being around the horses, but I didn't really like riding them. I was just a timid around them, and that wasn't my thing. And I also always loved dogs. My family had a pet dog or two during my whole childhood, and I had a black rabbit that I kept in a cage and then would let out and kind of play with in the yard and maintain her cage and keep her fed. So I was definitely into pets.
Speaking of horses, there was an incident with some cowboy boots.
Yeah. Like I said, my older sister was the one who had the horses and was the cowgirl. And I really admired that and looked up to her and to my best friend growing up, Tabby, who still is a cowgirl. And I always loved that. But so my sister had these really cool Western clothes that my mom would sew for her, matching outfits. And she had a pair of cowboy boots, but her feet were at least a size smaller than mine. And yeah, one day I had a friend coming over named Patty, and I wanted to show her just what a true cowgirl I was. So I put my sister's cowboy boots on so that when she showed up, I'd be kind of strutting around in my sister's cowgirl boots, and I could play off that they were mine. But when it came time to get them off, I couldn't pull them off and needed some help. So my show really didn't play out the way I had planned. Living so close to all these mountains, I have fond memories of spending quite a bit of time at all of those mountains. During the wintertime, my family would go up sledding at Mount Rainier. We'd drive up to Paradise, and whenever family or friends would come visit from anywhere, we'd always go on trips to Mount Rainier and go to Sunrise Visitor Center and just hike around all of those trails that were right around the base of the mountain. And also I'd spend a lot of time at Tackalack Lake near Mount Adams. That was a very popular place for big family camping trips and swimming in the lake. And I have great memories of all of that. And I was also living in Mossy Rock when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980 and have quite vivid memories of the whole experience of what led up to the huge eruption, because there were quite a few mini eruptions before the big one. And so that really had a big impact on my life. One of my classmates, her father died in the eruption of Mount St. Helens, and Spirit Lake, which was one of the popular campgrounds and a place that my family would go camping quite a bit. We'd spend at least 2 weeks there every summer. That lake just essentially disappeared in the eruption. So that volcanic experience with Mount St. Helens had a huge impact on my life and on my childhood. I was really a fairly introverted child, but I always had at least one or two close friends growing up, and being in such a small school, those were friends that I made in first grade and had all the way until I graduated from high school. My friend Tabby, she and I both went off to Washington State University, which is also where my sister had gone the year before. So some of the friends that I had in high school, I carried on those friendships as I went away to college. But I've really been one to just hold one or two friends kind of tightly and not have a huge social circle. When I graduated from high school and went to Washington State University, I really enjoyed my time there in Pullman, and that was my first experience with that climate on the east side of the Cascades, having grown up on the western slopes of the Cascade Mountains. I was used to that wet climate and really enjoyed the dry, cold climate in the winters and the sunshine in the spring and the cold, clear fall weather that happened in the autumn over there on the other side of the mountains. And after 2 years there, I dropped out of college and just lived in Pullman for a third year, just working at a sub shop there. After my time spent at Washington State University in Pullman, I came back to the western side of the Cascades. My sister had graduated from college and was working at St. Joseph's Hospital in Tacoma, so she had a nice little apartment. I moved in with her there and started into working as a waitress, which is kind of a career path I took for probably 5 to 7 years in my early 20s. After that restaurant work that I did in Tacoma, I moved to Ocean City, Maryland, where I had some extended family. I had a cousin that was my age, and she invited me to go live with her and experience the beach life for a summer. So that was something I did once I landed there. I loved it so much, and spending time on the beach, swimming in the ocean, and just having a great social life and enjoying, just time walking the beach and riding my bike up and down the coastline. I ended up living there for 2 years. And when I came back from the East Coast, my parents at that time had moved from the Mossy Rock area up north to La Conner, Washington. And so I landed there with them for a little bit and discovered the North Cascades. I was looking for my own place, and a small cabin was for rent up in the town of Marble Mount that's considered really, kind of like the foothills of the North Cascades. And I had never been up there before, and it was January, and this cabin was just a couple $100 rent a month and showed up in the newspaper. So I went to look at it and just right on the spot said, yes, I am going to live here. There was a couple feet of snow on the ground, and I could see the beautiful mountains and huge trees surrounding the cabin, and this really wonderful family owned the cabin. And there were some other rentals there too, with some other young people that were living in the area, and that was it. I was sold. I made it through that winter there, commuting into Mount Vernon, just shy of an hour each day to work at a pizzeria that had just opened, and just continued doing that commute for a couple of years. And during the summertime, exploring and hiking, just all these long solo hikes all through the North Cascades, just ticking off hikes in a trail guide that I had, and meeting other people while I was out there hiking. And at that time, I started working in Marble Mount. Rather than doing the commute, I started cleaning cabins at a place called Clark's Cabins there. So in my time working at Clark's Cabins, I met the birth father of my daughter, Angela, and tragically he died when she was just 11 months old, which left me as a single mom. At that time, my parents had moved from La Conner to Anacortes, so I went and stayed with them as I got on my feet and was able to find a nice little house in a neighborhood on Smilk Bay, just outside of Anacortes, and started a home daycare so that I could be with Angela as much as possible. And I just loved that job. I had a big garden, and I was out in the yard playing with the kids and working in the garden and enjoying the sunshine. And suddenly I saw that a truck had pulled up into the neighborhood, and the driver had gotten out and was running from house to house trying to find new customers. I hadn't seen the truck in the neighborhood before. And I noticed this truck driver, and my eyes were drawn right away to his bright red Chuck Taylors and just his spirit and his energy, the way he was running from house to house. And I was definitely interested in finding out more about this guy.
Aw, that's going back over 20 years to 1996 when we first met, but going even further back all the way to 1971 is when I was born in Oxnard, California, and raised in nearby Camarillo, California. And I was, as far as I know, a fairly normal child. I obviously don't have memories of my very early years. I know when I was 5, we moved to Virginia for a year because my father worked for a government defense contractor and needed to relocate for a year. So for a year, I lived in Virginia, and I remember there was a wooded area on the verge of where we lived, like not very far away, and every once in a while I'd go up there and just take a few steps into the woods, but I remember being afraid of it. I remember thinking that it was scary and dangerous and that there could be things living in there, and despite living there for a year with access to this wooded area, I really never ventured in there more than 20 or 30 feet as far as I can remember. Then we moved back to the same place that we had lived before, but because of being gone for a year, the friends that I had had weren't there anymore or didn't remember me, and I was new to the other kids. And that ended up being the kind of beginning of me being displaced from any group of peers that I'd had. And it continued on because I went to a private school for 4 years in 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So during that time, the kids going to the public school didn't know who I was, so when I would play sports like soccer and football, I was sort of an outsider and I wasn't part of their peer groups. But I did enjoy sports. I played soccer for 5 years. I was a goalie, and the way I remember it is that I was a pretty killer goalie. But I wanted to play football, and my parents kept saying, well, you're too young. And this was even before the concern about head traumas. But I continued playing soccer and enjoyed being goalie because it was the most physical and kind of aggressive of the positions. And I still remember the thrill and the adrenaline rush of having one of the opposing team's forwards just blitzing me and standing there as a single person in the goal, having to defend and really kind of enjoying that exhilaration. And I can still remember that. But after 5 years, I finally was allowed to play football. I really enjoyed playing football. I enjoyed the aggressive nature of it. And at the height of my career in 8th grade, I was starting on both offense and defense. So performing pretty well, but really just enjoy the game. Once I get into high school, not so much. Again, when I went to a public high school, people didn't know who I was, so I was kind of an outsider and sort of rejected by everybody. And I remember not really getting it and just thinking like, what's up? Why don't you like me? And after trying a little bit and just realizing that they didn't like me, that ended up being the real beginning of me sort of rejecting society in turn. It's like, all right, if you don't like me, I don't like you, and just beginning to do my own thing and not care what other people said. And then, ironically, by the end of high school, I was just so weird and out there and doing my own thing that it actually became kind of cool and people were respecting me for it. And then all of a sudden, like guys that had threatened to beat me up and tease me and been jerks to me throughout high school, all of a sudden were like trying to give me a chuck on the shoulder and be like, hey man, what's up? And I just wasn't into it. It seemed really phony to me at that point. There were a couple of early incidents that maybe point to the future development of me as a biped and a runner and as an overall ultrapedestrian. So those birth of an ultrapedestrian moments are perhaps interesting. When I was about 10-ish, around there, I was going to what they called a day camp. It was actually daycare, but it was during the summer, so school was out. Both my parents were working. I was what was called a latchkey kid. Nowadays, it's just called a kid. I was part of this supposed first generation of kids that were coming home, letting themselves into the house with a key and not having anybody there to welcome them home or watch over them for the afternoon until both parents got home from work. So I get to bear that designation of latchkey kid, which is kind of funny because I doubt anybody under the age of 40 even remembers that term. So I was a latchkey kid. So during the summer, they didn't want to leave me home completely unsupervised for that amount of time. And it might have been a little younger than 10. It might have been more like 8. I don't have a super distinct memory of my age. I just remember when I was going to that daycare. But one day I was super excited because we were supposed to be going tubing. We were going to load into buses and go out to the beach at Carpinteria, I believe, and ride inner tubes on the waves. And I'd never done that, and I was super stoked about it. And my mom dropped me off in the morning. I had all my beach gear. She drove off, and I went in and talked to the counselors, and they're like, "Oh, well, where's your inner tube?" And I didn't have an inner tube because I was under the impression that they were providing them. So all of a sudden, what I think is going to be this killer fun day is not going to be fun at all because I'm going to be one of the only kids without an inner tube. And there's definitely an argument you could make for me just being kind of a spoiled brat who was upset about not getting his way. As a, middle-class white kid in Southern California, it would be hard for me to argue against that read on the situation. But what I think is interesting is the way I responded. And in a moment of crisis, there's really kind of two different responses that human beings come back with. And one is to feel defeated and to have sort of a depressive response. The other is to get angry and to fight back. And I've always kind of had that angry fight back response. And at this young age, 8-ish, between 8 and 10, somewhere in there, could call it 9, I remember being angry and upset enough that I was like, this isn't right. I'm going to do something about it. So I left the daycare at the park and walked to where my mom worked to talk to her to try to get this situation rectified. And the thing is, my mom worked about 5 miles away, not even in the town of Camarillo, but between Camarillo and Oxnard, just out on these series of like high-speed 50-mile-an-hour county roads where there wasn't sidewalks. I mean, looking back, it's pretty cool. I don't know why I thought that I even could walk that distance, but it really wasn't an issue. I was just like, I'm going to do this. And so I showed up a couple hours later at my mom's work, which was at a government facility with like a guard at the gate. So she gets called down to the gate being told that her son's there, which she probably just couldn't even fathom. Had to take time off to work, drive me back to day camp, where of course everybody's upset with me because the whole trip has been postponed because I disappeared, which you're not supposed to do. Still ended up going to the beach, wasn't able to get a hold of a inner tube. I remember trying to convince my mom on the way there that we should stop at a gas station and try to buy me an inner tube, and she wasn't having it. But looking back, it's interesting because I think that stubbornness, that bloody-mindedness, and the idea of like taking action, and then even on the drive back trying to get my mom to stop and buy me an inner tube, I think all of those actions, all of those personality traits very much show through in what I do now with adventuring. So maybe that's an early glimpse about that. Another interesting thing I have vague memories of is that there was a walkathon, a local walkathon done for charity, partly through my church. I don't remember all the specifics, but I remember I did that for probably 3 or maybe 4 years. So I'd go around, talk to the neighbors, and you get people to sponsor you, to pay a certain amount for each mile that you're going to walk. And if I remember correctly, it was a 6-mile course, a 10K course. And so I was a kid. People expected me to maybe walk a mile or a half a mile. So a lot of people were donating 25 cents a mile. Some people did $1 a mile because they didn't think I'd even make a mile. And every year I did the complete course. On my own. I don't remember walking it with friends, but I participated in the event, did the complete course, and went around and collected. And I remember having some people a little bit shocked where they were like, what? Having to pay $6 where they thought they might have to pay $1. And of course, this is in the 80s. So $1 was a little bit more than it was now, but it wouldn't buy you a, round trip airfare to Chicago or anything like that. But I do remember doing that. So there's a couple glimpses into early bipedalism, and I don't even know what it was based on. But as I got into my teen years and stuff, I did spend a lot of time walking or riding my BMX freestyle bike around town or skating around town. So I was often out sort of pedestrianing in one form or another, using some sort of human-powered locomotion to cruise around town, even when I got into my teen years and was washing dishes at a Japanese restaurant. And I'd be skating home at 10 or midnight sometimes after work on Fridays and Saturdays. And I always really enjoyed moving at night when there were not that many people around, although I do remember a couple times being chased home by redneck kids in their raised jacked up pickup trucks and throwing rocks at them and dinging their vehicles and having them confront me at school days later, all that sort of standard teen drama. Another interesting thing I think in my development is my first backpacking trip, because people might have this idea of like, oh, these crazy thru-hikers putting up new routes and going after only known times and fastest known times. They must have been exceptional athletes their whole time and had these amazing experiences. But my very first backpacking trip ended with my entire scout troop being airlifted out of the California wilderness between Lakes Pyramid and Piru. There was an organized trip through my scout troop. And again, I was kind of an outcast in the scout troop because I hadn't gone to the public schools with the other kids and they kind of didn't like me. So I didn't really have any friends. I was just kind of like co-soloing with this whole group. I remember having jeans, multiple pairs of jeans with me, this big fluffy cotton sleeping bag. I can remember some of the gear, and I can remember being really cold and uncomfortable at night as well. But we were supposed to be hiking from Lake Pyramid to Lake Piru, and some of the trail had been washed out, something like that, because the scoutmasters, there were 3 adults with the group leading it, lost their way. And I remember the night before we were airlifted out, all of a whole Boy Scout troop wading down this creek through a slot canyon with like sheer cliff walls coming right down into the water. And looking back on that, knowing what I know now about canyoneering and traveling in areas where there can be flash floods, because this was inland Southern California, which is essentially desert or an arid area. It would only have taken a cloudburst a couple miles from there that you wouldn't even necessarily be able to see to send a wall of water down this thing and wipe out the entire scout troop. So looking back, it's crazy that we were even in that situation. But we made it through. Everybody got wet jumping down this little waterfall. The next day, at that point, we were already more than a day late. So again, this was Southern California in the early 80s. You've got an entire troop of white middle-class kids that are lost in the wilderness. So of course, they sent in the National Guard like right away. So we were airlifted out in 2 or 3 trips in these big old helicopters. Pretty exciting experience. But for anybody who's thinking, oh, Ras must have had this incredible foundation. I didn't. I started off as a complete novice. My very first backpacking trip ended up being airlifted out. So that just shows no matter how bad your start is, you can go on and learn the skills and train your mind and body to do the things you need them to do. And that's, of course, what this podcast is all about. Moving on from there, in junior high, I had an interest in running and I wanted to run. But again, I went to this small private Christian school, and I was the only kid that was interested in running cross country. So when we would have practice, the coach would basically just tell me to run around the whole field. And while I was doing that, he would work with the other kids that were doing the things he was interested in, like high jumping and long jump and the shorter distances and all that. And on more than one occasion, I honestly think he just forgot about me because he didn't tell me to run a number of laps. He wasn't timing me or keeping track of the number of laps. And when I would finally just ask him, what do you want me to do? He'd be like, well, if you're running cross country, you should just be running, keep running. And I don't remember ever stopping, but I remember quitting at a certain point because he just wasn't teaching me how to do anything. I could go out and run around the track on my own. And so that ended up going nowhere, although I did have an interest early on in long distance running, but I didn't have anywhere really to go with it and gave up on it kind of quickly. After I graduated high school, which I did do. I am a high school graduate. I didn't graduate with the rest of my class, but I did get my diploma. They graduated, normal time in June, and I graduated in January, I think. But so got my diploma after I graduated high school, stayed in the area for a little bit, but I'd always imagined myself moving north. My father was from Washington and had met my mother in San Diego, and they had settled down in Southern California as a result of that, which is where I was born and raised. But I had visited Seattle a couple times to see my grandfather, my dad's father, and had always imagined myself moving up to Washington to live in the woods and try to find Sasquatch. That was my childhood vision of my future. One could argue that I've succeeded in doing exactly that, in moving to Washington and living in the woods and finding my own inner Sasquatch at the very least. So I lived in Santa Cruz for 4 years or so, had a lot of mind-expanding experiences, not chemically induced or anything like that, but just meeting a lot of very different people. Had my first exposure to Rastafari and Nyabingi on an intimate level rather than just hearing reggae music and not really knowing the messages I was receiving. A lot of kind of key turning points in my life happened or began there. And while I lived in Santa Cruz, I rode a mountain bike just about everywhere. I did own a car. I think I owned a few cars because I would buy or find and salvage old VWs and then fix them up and sell them off again, was how I made a little bit of money. I also worked at an organic sauerkraut plant and nut butter plant. So I was involved with doing that, making and packaging food, and just rode my bike everywhere. I had a trailer so I could haul groceries home. I could haul my laundry to and from the laundromat, and really enjoyed being a human-powered vehicle cruising around the streets. And there was the whole people power movement in Santa Cruz. I still have a sticker on one of my old bikes, a people power sticker. So it was a great place to do that and to be exposed to those sorts of ideas. But after 4 years there, I followed my early childhood dreams of moving further north and moved all the way up to Washington State. So the year was 1996, and I was working as a frozen food delivery driver. And it was a truck driving job, but it was also a sales job where I would go into neighborhoods and go around and knock on all the doors and talk to people to try to sign up new customers and leave them catalogs. And in order to do that and to just cover as many doors as I could in a day, which was sort of the numbers game, which made it so that I could earn a living, I would jog back and forth between the truck and going up and down the streets. I just jogged to all the doors so that I could hit as many as possible. And, in the back of my mind with the idea that it would help keep me fit to some degree, but that wasn't my main motivation. My main motivation was just keeping myself moving, and I'd literally knocked on darn near every door in Bellingham and then had been sent down into Skagit County, into the LaConner area. And I was doing that in this neighborhood, which was mostly vacation rentals right on the beach, and there were very, very few people home or even inhabiting them full time. And I came upon a really unique little structure, a tiny little yellow house. That little houses like that always kind of catch my attention because they're sort of rare in the United States, where houses tend to be grandiose. And knocked on the door. There was no response, but I heard sounds from out back. So I walked around the back of the house. It was an open yard. There wasn't a fence or anything, and it was open to the street. And when I came around the corner, I saw this woman standing barefoot in a little garden patch with a bunch of kids running around. And there was a bright sunny day, and she had golden hair, and it seemed like all of the sunshine in that day was emanating from her. And that was Kathy. And that's the first memory I have of her. I can remember it as though it just happened yesterday. So then what happened? How did we end up getting to know each other?
Well, I knew I wanted to get to know you more, and I liked the way you joked around and seemed like you had a fun sense of humor, and I liked the way you played around, interacted with the kids when you were around. So I decided I would make the first move because you were on the job and maybe couldn't. So I asked if you might want to go out for coffee sometime, and you said you would, and so I was super excited. But before we had a chance for that, it was in spring, it was in March, and I was having an Easter party, and he was in the neighborhood just a couple days before Easter, before the day of the party. So I actually just invited him to come by to the party, and he said that he had to work that day, but he would come by when he got off. And so I think it was probably about 11 p.m. when he finally got there that night.
I just saw this amazing opportunity with this strong, independent woman who had this amazing little girl that I got to meet, and just knew that it was this incredible potential blessing to be a part of their lives for the rest of my life, if possible. We talked about it, taking everything into account, having to do with Angela's best interests and decided that we would get married sooner rather than later, not make it a long drawn out thing, and make an official family of ourselves. 6 months later, we were married and started buying a small house in Bellingham and moved up to Bellingham. And in a lot of ways, that was obviously the beginning of this whole grand adventure that's become our lives together, but only the beginning of the story and not really what led to us becoming Team UltraPedestrian. At the time, I was driving a truck 90 hours a week most of the time. Most weeks I was working 6 days a week, and the maximum 15 hours a day that you're allowed on a commercial driver's license to be working, because the job was paid based on sales, not based on time. So I was trying to pay for this house. I was trying to make it so that Kathy could be a stay-at-home mom and provide the very best upbringing for Angela that was possible. And just kind of trapped into that. I mean, when I was doing my very best at that job, I was making $50,000 a year. So things looked really bright, and it seemed like our economic future was stable, and we were getting kind of sucked into that middle-class type lifestyle. So fast forward a little bit, and from eating a lot of the frozen foods that I was supposed to be selling and keeping our freezer stocked with them and snacking on them all day long, I ballooned up to 265 pounds at my biggest, my most corpulent. 265 pounds of Ras. That's quite a thing to imagine.
And even though when I first met Ras in the frozen food delivery truck, and one of the ways that I got him to come back to my house was by ordering a bag of stir-fry veggies so that he would return, because I was already vegetarian at that time. I too, once we got married, started indulging in those frozen food and processed foods, and I ballooned up to 165 pounds during those first initial few years of our relationship. So we had a lot of work to do, a lot of turning around in the path that we were starting to take. I had always been a really active person and always into the power hiking trend that happened in the early 90s, and was into aerobics and staying active and fit, and loved being on any trails that went through forests or up to mountain lakes. And so that ended up being our saving grace, because I always held on to that. And in our days in Bellingham, once I discovered Fragrance Lake, I went on regular hikes up there. And after dropping Angela off at preschool, and then, later on when she was in kindergarten, that was my priority, was to hit the trails once I got her settled into school for the day.
And I was very much what you would call indoorsy at the time. Working 6 days a week, on my one day off, I didn't want to go hiking or running or even stand up very much. I wanted to sit on the sofa and drink a 2-liter bottle of RC Cola and eat a family-size pizza while I watched television. So fortunately, Kathy wasn't resigned to or willing to allow me to do that. And she just kept inviting me to go on hikes with her and encouraging me and even cajoling and nagging me, whatever it took. Or she was getting me out on the trail, as pitiful a sight as it was. I was a big gelatinous dude. I had big hairy man boobs. I wasn't anything that anybody would aspire to be. For comparison, walking around at 265, like in later years when I was fighting jiu-jitsu and stuff, I would cut to 170, 95 pounds lighter. So 265 was definitely a lot of meat on my frame, and it wasn't good for me in any way, nor was it flattering. So fortunately, she kept encouraging me, and I would go out to try to do this Fragrance Lake hike with her. And people in the Bellingham area are going to be familiar with that. And it's a stiff climb for about 2 miles up to the lake, and I couldn't even get a mile into it before I would be crouched over on the side of the trail with my back spasming, trying to stretch it out so that I could keep hiking. It would take us a long time to hike those 2 miles uphill when I was with Kathy. But she kept encouraging me and getting me out there and finding other little short trails for us to do in the greater Bellingham area, and some slightly longer ones up in the North Cascades. And I was very gradually able to drop some weight and build some strength and begin learning the very basics, the very most essential aspects of the mental game that's actually so important to this whole thing. I credit Kathy with saving my life. I was literally eating myself to death. And 20 years later, there's just no way I could have continued on that path. Things either had to change or I wasn't going to survive as an organism. That was just the reality of it. So finally, Kathy had the idea that we as a family should hike the Wonderland Trail. So this was when Angela was 7, so about 4 years after we'd gotten married and become a family. And I honestly don't know why she thought that we would be able to do that. Like at the time, especially my fitness level, our lack of experience on the trails, to me, looking back, it just doesn't even seem like a reasonable thing to think that we could do. But she thought that we could do it. And I love the idea of it. My entire life, I'd seen myself as an adventurous and outdoorsy person, even if I wasn't. And the idea seemed amazing to me. It didn't really seem possible, but it certainly seemed like it was worth giving a go. How did you even come up with that idea?
Well, most of my memories and images of the trails around Mount Rainier were from idyllic memories of my childhood when we'd go up to Paradise and walk around paved trails looking at the flower meadows or, sunrise, the same kind of thing. My family had a good ranger friend that led the ranger station at Ohanapecosh, and that's one of the areas of the park that has just beautiful old growth forests. And I spent a lot of time traipsing around those trails as a child. So my images of what the trail around Mount Rainier would be like were these woodland paths that just kind of twisted and wound their way for just shy of 100 miles around Mount Rainier. So we were definitely all in for quite a rude awakening when we started attempting hiking through places like the Panhandle Gap or in areas where we had to hike alongside active glaciers and we're just tiptoeing our way uphill in the heat of the day through rocky areas. It was such a growing and awesome, challenging experience for our family. But it really came from my memories of little babbling brooks and waterfalls and just a gentle woodland trail around the mountain.
Before we did the Wonderland as a family, we had one other multiple overnight hike that we did, which was a pretty pivotal experience and maybe began the first little glowing embers before our love of trail was really sparked. Do you remember that, Kathy?
I do. I had been looking through the North Cascades trail guide quite a bit, looking for trails that looked like they were ones that we could hike, and was really in particular looking for a loop hike where we could start at one location and hike around and finish in that same spot and just leave our car there. And it was Labor Day weekend, and so we wanted to go without Angela and just kind of test our own skills and wit out in the wilds. And I chose a loop called the Devil's Dome Loop. It's a pretty classic loop in the Pasayten Wilderness in the North Cascades. And the loop, from my recollection at the time, it seemed like I saw the mileage as being 40 miles total for the loop. So I thought, that's awesome. We can do 10 miles a day, no problem. And that was our plan. We didn't really have any proper backpacking gear, so we went to an outdoor rental shop in Bellingham and rented our boots. We rented packs, sleeping bags, a tent. We rented everything, so we had absolutely no familiarity with this gear at all. I believe we carried a plastic 1-gallon jug for our water. I really don't know what we were filtering with, probably tablets of some kind. And we set out. When Ras got off work on Friday night, we drove up to the North Cascades from Bellingham and set foot on the trail, made it up about 2 switchbacks, completely out of breath, and proceeded to try to pitch our tent right on the side of a super steep slope on a switchback. We knew we weren't going to make it any further that night. It seemed like we saw one other hiker coming down off the trail. And we woke up the next morning and started this adventure. And the Devil's Dome Loop is a rugged but absolutely beautiful, a term we like to use, brutiful. This is just a classic brutiful loop in the North Cascades. And we hiked through alpine meadows. We hiked across scree slopes. There were tons of switchbacks. We became very familiar with what a switchback is and how challenging those are to climb when you're out of shape and carrying a big, heavy pack and carrying all your fears with you, everything you think you might need, and probably most of what we didn't need. And I remember just being eaten alive by mosquitoes and black biting flies and having no skill or patience or anything at how to deal with those kinds of challenges along the trail. By our final day, knowing that we had to complete the hike that day and get back out to our car and get back to my parents' home in La Conner to pick up Angela, we woke up to just pouring rain. In September in the mountains, rain can get very cold very quickly. And we just hiked and hiked. I think we had maybe 15 miles to hike that day because we hadn't made our mileage in the days leading up to that. I remember having to sit on the single track trail that is right along Ross Lake with about 10 miles left to go. And Ross was just shivering. He was just sopped to the bone. He couldn't take it anymore. And we got him bundled up and set up a little spot on the side of the trail. We got out our stove that we had rented, and we had some tea bags with us. It seems like I was able to make him a cup of ginger tea and just look out over the lake at the rain pattering down onto it and the fog covering the distant mountains, Hominid Peak, and all these beautiful peaks all along Ross Lake. And as miserable and kind of scared and nervous and in over our heads as we were sold. This was it. This was not going to be our last backpacking trip.
I think Kathy was more sold than I was at that moment. I remember fearing for my life. It sounds dramatic now and silly, but at the time I was out of shape and super experienced, and I was really, really cold and had been cold and wet for hours and knew that I had hours of that ahead of me. And I tried to get Kathy to agree to trying to flag down a boat passing on Ross Lake to get a ride out because I really was concerned to that degree that this was potentially a life-threatening situation. Looking back, I don't know exactly how much mileage we had, but I actually think we had something close to 18 or even 20 miles to do that day because we had camped somewhere west of the Devil's Dome shelter. But we were still up a couple miles of switchbacks. So we had to do a couple, let's call it 2 miles down to Ross Lake, and then it's 15 miles from there to the East Bank trailhead. And we had actually parked 3 miles east of that up the highway, remember? So that really is in the ballpark of 20 miles, I think. It was pouring rain, and by the very end, when we, rather than doing the last 3 miles on trail, we actually went out and hiked on the shoulder of the highway to hitchhike in hopes that someone would pick us up. No one did because, of course, we were sopping wet, and nobody wants to pick up sopping wet backpackers. We ended up just grinding out that last 3.5 miles on the shoulder of the road, and every step hurt. Like the bottoms of my feet were just screaming in pain. All the muscles, I can remember that pretty vividly. And that was a death march. There's no other way to describe it. We didn't know endurance sports terms at that time, like embracing the suck or sufferfest, these concepts that you can...
The pain cave.
Yeah, there's these concepts you can use that are amazing mental tools to get through things like this when it's something you've experienced before and can identify, and then you know how to engage those tools. We didn't have any of that. We didn't have the experience. We didn't have those tools to make use of, and yet somehow, not knowing what we were doing, being inexperienced, being out of shape, being ignorant, being in over our heads, being where we didn't belong, we still pulled it off. And after we actually pulled it off, I do remember later that night in just miserable pain, thinking the same thing that Kathy had apparently thought while we were still back on the East Bank Trail in the rain, that we had done something amazing that we wanted to do again. In retrospect, we did something poorly and very horribly. It was not a pretty performance. It wasn't a competent performance, but we did it against what we even thought we could do, and against the odds. We actually completed that loop, and it is a classic loop. It's a loop that people still go out and test themselves on as a single-day ultra run, as a couple-day fast pack, as a multi-day backpacking trip. It's a classic route. We'd encourage anybody to check it out and go out and tick it off your list. It's worth doing, but that really was a foundational experience for us. So fast forward another year or two, and we're on the Wonderland Trail. So 93 miles around the base of Mount Rainier, something in the realm of 23,000 feet of elevation gain, I believe. I hear a lot of inflated numbers, 25, 27 on the internet and stuff, and it's not that many, but it's up there. It's in the low 20s. It's substantial. There's very, very few places on the Wonderland Trail that are flat at all. There's a few miles here and there, but it's almost always climbing or descending. And as a family with our 7-year-old daughter, carrying her own pack and a little bit of her clothing and snacks for each day, the three of us, it took us 20 days to do 93 miles. So I'm sure you all just did the math in your heads real quickly. Not an impressive performance, but after we finished that was when we really knew there was no going back. That spark had been ignited within us, and we had completely fallen in love with being on the trail and with that being our life, with living on the trail.
By that time, Ras knew that he wasn't going to be able to keep working this career as a frozen food delivery guy, that it just kept him away from the family and out driving around in a truck for too many hours each day. And then he just felt like being on the couch on his days off. So one of the dads, Evangela's best buddy when she was in kindergarten, worked as a tugboat captain. And this just really piqued Ras's interest. And so he started working as a cook on tugboats and being able to take this trip up the Inside Passage up to Alaska. And so the next summer, rather than repeat the Wonderland Trail as a family for our second time, Angela and I went with one of her classmates, a boy named Nick, and his parents, and we went around the Wonderland Trail for our second time without Ras. And I'm not sure if it was the following summer or the next summer, but we did it again, and we continued to evolve in the way that we hiked the Wonderland Trail, and we went around it together as a family, I think another 6 or 7 times, the final time being the year that Angela graduated from high school. And at that point, we had already started into some trail and mountain running, and so we did it in 4 days, including some running into the mix. Now I think Ras has done the Wonderland Trail 13 times, including being the first person to do it as a double Wonderland, doing it in one go and then turning around and reversing direction and completing the entire loop a second time. We've done it as just an overnight run together as a couple, and we've done it with a group of other ultra runners in a supported 3-day run. And it's just really foundational and pivotal in our experiences of being on the trail. And I remember, I don't know which of the times that it was that I was hiking on the Wonderland, but as I was trekking along, I remember thinking, this is what I want to do all the time. I want to always be hiking and always be on the trail. I don't know how I'm going to make it happen, but this is it. This is where I feel the most alive. This is where I'm connected to who and what I am and why I'm even on this planet. And this is what makes the most sense to me.
We hope you enjoyed the first half of the Team UltraPedestrian origin story today. In episode number 2 of the Hominid UP podcast, we'll be taking you from that initial Wonderland circumnavigation, which was so key and foundational to us, all the way up to present day with the completion of the Up North Loop in 2018, and a brief glimpse of all of the amazing things that we've learned along the way. Then going forward in episode number 3 of Hominid UP, we will get to our full podcast format, and we will continue to delve into the amazing and extraordinary things of which ordinary human beings are capable, and trying to figure out the secrets of how to access the hidden reserves of strength that all human beings have that enable us to do things like lift cars off of children. So in upcoming episodes, we're going to be talking about all of that. We're going to be talking about our unique training methods and cross-training and a just completely different approach to running and training that we have than the main sports-oriented perspective on running. We're going to be talking about thru-hiking and mountaineering and fueling for extended endurance adventures. And we're going to be talking about our time living off-grid and what we learned from that and how you can apply that to your modern lives. And our main goal is going to be helping people learn how to reconnect with the ancient aspects of their humanity that really lead to a better life and to a more healthful life and to more enjoyment of the life that we've all been given.
Along the way, we'll be introducing you to some of the friends we've made in the adventure world and help to highlight and honor other hominids.
So we want to thank you for joining us for this first episode of Hominid Up. And any way that you want to be involved, if you're loving this and you just want the free content, then subscribe to the podcast and you'll get the free content every month. If you are interested in more details, then you can join our Patreon and get a ton of exclusive content that's not going to be put out on the smaller podcasts that go public. You can do that by going to patreon.com/ultrapedestrian for as little as $1.25 a month. But regardless, we thank you for joining us on the first episode of our podcast, and we look forward to you joining us again on future episodes of Hominid Up.